These desert animals, they have a large amount of fat stored in them. One more example that I can take of is the camel. So the plant should not lose water. And if the stomata is exposed and open, the water loss is quite high, right? Here a variety of marine invertebrates and also some of the fishes, they live in the greater depths of the ocean where the pressure. Hello everyone, a warm welcome to another session of Chapter 13, Second PUC, Organisms and Population. I'm Dr. Divya, Biology Faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysuru, Temple of Excellence. So in the previous session of this chapter, we had discussed about how the organisms respond to various abiotic factors, especially when it comes to temperature in water. And under that, we had studied about the regulators, and when it comes to conformers, how the organisms migrate and suspend their activities because they are not capable of regulating their body temperature. In today's session, we shall study how different organisms, they adapt themselves to various abiotic stresses. So to begin with the session, we shall see the adaptations of organisms to various abiotic factors. Attribute of the organism or the characteristic of the organism, be it morphological, physiological or behavioral, is the one that actually helps the organism to reproduce and to survive and adapt itself in different environmental conditions. So, the attributes of the organism such as morphological, physiological, behavioral are the different characteristics that are there in an organism that enables the organism to survive and reproduce in its habitat. And also, there are many adaptations that have evolved in a particular organism over a long period of time. That is, for about thousands to thousands of years, the organisms would have evolved. And we all know that evolution is one of the important factors for the survival of the organism. So, evolution is nothing but the organism's characteristic changes during a course of time or a period of time in order so that the organism can survive in that particular environment or any of the changing environmental condition. So many adaptations have evolved over a long evolutionary time and they are also genetically fixed. So genetically fixed. So how can an organism evolve themselves? So something has to happen with that of the genes, right? Then only the organisms can evolve, wherein the coming progenies, they can carry the same traits of that of the parent, or the evolved traits of the parent they can carry. So therefore, the evolution of an organism during a period of time and also these particular adaptation that are undertaken by the organism, it is also genetically fixed. So let us study about certain examples which actually helps us to better understand how different organisms respond to different abiotic factors. So we know that the different abiotic factors are temperature, light, water and soil, right? And here temperature and light are one and the same. They go hand in hand. Why? Because if the sunlight is more intense, then the temperature is also more. The sunlight is not there at all, then the temperature drastically reduces. That is, we can study the different organisms living in different biomes, be it the grasslands, the desert biome, the tropical rainforest biome, the temperate biome, or be it the Antarctic region where every time it is snow-capped or snow-laden. So all these different organisms, they adapt themselves to survive in that particular environment. Saying that, don't think that any organism, if you put it there, within a year, they will adapt itself to live in that particular environment. It is not possible. And if that organism which does not belong to that habitat, if it has to survive and adapt in that particular habitat, it has to again undergo a long process of evolution over a period of time so that it can adapt itself. But spontaneously, no organism can adapt itself other than its natural habitat where it is living since many ages. So that is how the organisms are specific to different type of biomes. So here the example of kangaroo rat if we can take. So kangaroo rat in North American deserts. So these kangaroo rats, so deserts, we know that the temperature is very high, and temperature is also high in different regions. But why have they not become a desert? It's because they are receiving enough amount of precipitation either in the form of rain or snow, right? So that is why they have not become a desert. But in desert condition, what happens? The temperature is also high. The precipitation is also negligible amount, so which results in scarcity of water. And we all know that organisms need enough amount of water if all their metabolic activity has to take place properly so that they can survive. But how do these desert animals living in such a high temperature climate with very less water, rarely when it rains, they receive water. So apart from that, how do they survive? How do they fulfill their needs for the water? The best example is kangaroo rat. So kangaroo rat in North American desert, they are capable of meeting all their water requirements. So they are capable of meeting all its water requirements through its internal fat oxidation. So these desert animals, they have a large amount of fat stored in them. One more example that I can take of is the camel. So camel has a lot of fat stored in its hump, right? So in that fat content, the water is stored, and when the oxidation of the fat occurs, the water gets released, wherein these camels can make use of that particular water. Likewise, in the desert kangaroo rats, which is present in American deserts and also in the Australian deserts, these kangaroo rats usually, they have a fatty content in their body, and in that fatty tissues or fatty cells, the water is stored. And these fats, they undergo oxidation, and after oxidation, what happens to the fats? When water molecules, after oxidation process, what happens? The water will be, that is the end product that is got, or the byproduct that is got is water. So water will be obtained as a byproduct, and that oxidation process of the fat which forms water gives water to the rat, that is to the kangaroo rat. So that is how they adapt themselves. So the excretory function of the kangaroo rat is also in such a way that for the process of excretion or for the process of fecation, these kangaroo rats utilize much less amount of water, a concentrated amount of water. So when the amount of water utilized is much less, then the amount of water leaving the body will also be much less. So we all know that for the excretion process, water is one of the important factors, where during that process in the form of urination and excretion also, water is lost from the body. But if water gets lost, it is a problem for the animals living in the desert. For example, the kangaroo rat. So what the kangaroo rat does is, it has the ability to concentrate its urine. So the urine becomes concentrated and very little urine is passed out of the kangaroo rat. And one more thing is, for the excretion process or to throw out the excretory waste out of its body, this kangaroo rat uses very minimal volume of water to remove the excretory product. So this is how they adapt themselves. So taking one more example, so chem plants. So these are the crustacean acid metabolism plants, right? We all know that chem plants have thick cuticle on their leaf surface, and because of the presence of thick cuticle on the leaf surface, what happens? The stomata becomes sunken, and stomata, the exposure of stomata, the opening of stomata is very important if the carbon dioxide gas has to enter into the plants. And now the question arises, why do they need the carbon dioxide gas? If the carbon dioxide gas enters into the plant, then during photosynthesis, whatever glucose molecules would have been produced, that will be broken down into simpler forms which can be utilized by the plants, right? And for photosynthesis itself, the absorption of, that is, the carbon dioxide is needed. So how can the carbon dioxide enter? It has to enter through the stomata. Now, if the stomata itself is not open, how will the photosynthetic process occur? So here they undergo a particular kind of biochemical pathway which is called as the hatch and slack cycle. So here what they do is, they follow a hatch and slack mechanism in order to, that is, make the food or synthesize the food material. So here, so how these, but in spite of that having thick cuticle, one adaptation is they go in for a particular special kind of pathway called as the hatch and slack cycle, wherein they can photosynthesize the food. And other thing is, but the sinking of the stomata is very important in these cressolacin acid metabolism plants, because these plants usually grow in the deserts where there is scarcity of water. So the plant should not lose water. And if the stomata is exposed and open, the water loss is quite high, right? So that is why the stomata will be sunken, and also to prevent the excess loss of water, a thick cuticle will be covered on the leaf surface. Why all these? In order to minimize water loss through the process called as transpiration. So transpiration is nothing but the loss of water from the aerial parts of the plants through the stomata, or that is the openings or the pores that are there formed by the stomata. It is nothing but transpiration. So in order to minimize the loss of water, they have sunken stomata, and also the leaves are covered with, or the fleshy part of the leaves are covered with thick cuticle. And also they have a special photosynthetic pathway. I told you these plants have a special photosynthetic pathway. So almost all the other land plants, they usually photosynthesize by glycolysis and various other cycles, right? But here, if photosynthesis has to occur, they follow a particular pathway called as the hatch and slack pathway. And this hatch and slack pathway actually enables their stomata to remain closed during the day. So in spite of the absence of carbon dioxide, because the stomata are closed throughout the day, in spite of absence of carbon dioxide, they can also photosynthesize, or sometimes they undergo photosynthesis, that is especially by a pathway called as the hatch and slack pathway. So cactuses and various succulents, pineapples, all these are the best examples for cressolacin acid metabolism plants, which can even grow with the scarcity of water. So these are some of the characteristic features of the desert plants, or plants which are growing in conditions where availability of water is very less. So next, talking about one more example, that is Openshia. So Openshia, the prickly pear, it is nothing but Openshia. So it is also called as prickly pear. So Openshias, usually they don't have leaves. The leaves of the plant are modified into spines, right? So all the leaves, these are leaves modified into spines. So why are the leaves modified into spines? It is because so that if leaves are there, then the transpiration rate is more, the loss of water is more, because on the surface of the leaf, the stomata will be there. So that is why, in order to minimize the loss of water, they just modified the leaf itself into spine forms. So the leaves are reduced to, they have no leaves. Why? Because they are reduced to spines, and the photosynthetic function is carried out by the flattened stems itself. So these fleshy stems that are there, they not only store enough amount of water, but also they help in the process of photosynthesis, because here they do not have leaves, since the leaves are modified into spine in order to prevent the loss of water. And these animals or plants that is growing in the deserts, they are called as the conformers. So what are conformers? So conformers are those organisms which are not capable of regulating their body temperature. So that is why they either migrate to a different place, or they adapt themselves in various ways, or they completely suspend their activity. So these conformers which I had mentioned so far, be it the kangaroo rat or the succulents, that is the cressolacin acid metabolism plants or the cam plants, then this Openshia or the prickly pear, all these, they cannot migrate because they are plants, right? Can they move from one place to another? They cannot migrate. And these, they do not suspend their activity as well. But how have they adapted? They have adapted by certain modifications that they have made in their body, through that also through a process of evolution. So some modifications in order to survive in that extremely hot, water scarce conditions. So next, talking about some of the abiotic factors such as the temperature. So here also talking about the temperature. So here the temperature of the Antarctic region is completely sub-zero, right? It is 0 degree or below 0 degree. So here, how do these animals adapt themselves here? So in this particular region, the animals, they have thick furs on their body. Not just that, if we take the example of some of the seals that actually live in this particular region, that is the polar regions, they have thick fat covering called as blubber under their thick fat covering under their skin, which actually insulates the body of the seal, therefore keeping the heat within the body. Or usually these mammals, that are most of the mammals, so we all know that only large mammals live in the Arctic region. Why? Because in the previous session we had studied for small mammals, they cannot live in the Arctic region because or small animals, because that small size, if it loses heat, that is when it is losing heat, to replenish that heat, a lot of energy is needed, which cannot be fulfilled by the organism. So that is why only large mammals live in the cold regions or the polar regions. So mammals from colder climates, they generally have shorter ears and limbs. So here we have taken the example of various mammals that are living here. If you take a look at the different photographs that have been displayed here, you can see all these animals have very small ears and very short limbs. Why? So the best example I can give you is, even we in winters, if you don't wear a sweater also it is fine, just put a socks to your leg and cover your ears, you'll feel warm. Because it is said that most of the body heat is lost from the ears and the legs. So that is why in these organisms, because they are living in completely cold climate throughout the year, they have short limbs so that the heat is not lost, and also they have very small ears so that the heat is not lost. And this particular condition is called as the Allen's rule. So Allen's rule states that the organisms or the mammals living in the cold climatic conditions, in order to minimize the loss of heat from their body, they have very small ears and very short limbs. So that is how they have adapted themselves. So you can see the penguin, be it the polar bear, and the walruses and different forms of animals that have been displayed here all have very short ears and short limbs. So this is a kind of adaptation that they have followed. So next, talking about one more example, the polar seals. So the polar seals, actually they are aquatic mammals. So polar seals, they are the aquatic mammals. They just look like seals, but the only difference is these seals, because they are living in the polar region, which is completely laden with snow, they usually have a thick layer of fat. And that thick layer of fat is present just below the epidermis or the skin, and it is called as the blubber. So this blubber that is present below the skin, it acts like an insulator, because fat acts like an insulator, and this fat which acts as an insulator, thereby it reduces the loss of body heat. So that is how these seals survive the colder temperatures, because of the presence of a layer of fat called as blubber below their skin. So next, talking about various other examples, taking humans into consideration. So we humans also, we travel to colder regions during the summers, right? So there are a lot of trekkers and all that who trek up to a higher altitudes. So how can they survive there? Because there, first of all, oxygen availability is very less. But if our body has to function properly, then oxygen is one of the important component. But there, when the oxygen availability is very less in the higher altitudes, how do the people survive there? So people also tend to have certain adaptations in order to survive the adverse climatic conditions. So here, when tourists usually visit the Rohtang Pass, which is there near Manali and Leh, that is the altitude of the Rohtang Pass is more than 3,500 meter. So as soon as tourist goes there for the first time, they'll start to feel a little duration, they will start to feel or experience altitude sickness, which includes symptoms like nausea, that is vomiting sensation, then tiredness, which is also called as fatigue, and also heart palpitations. Heart palpitations, the heart starts to beat faster. So we can easily guess now why might the heart start to beat faster. It is because the availability of oxygen decreases as the altitude rises. So that is the reason. So in order to take in more amount of oxygen, the heart will start to beat fast. Why? Because the breathing will also start to increase fast. So Here, when we are in normal temperature, climatic conditions, our breathing, we cannot even feel that we are breathing because the breathing is so slow, right? But when we go to higher altitudes, our breathing becomes quite fast. Why? Because oxygen availability is less, so that we need to take in more amount of oxygen very fast in a faster rate. So that is why we breathe fast. And as more amount of oxygen is entering into the lungs, from the lungs it has to be carried by the blood to the heart, right? So when it has to be carried to the heart, now the heart has to function very fast. So that is why the rhythmic beating of the heart will become more. So that is why the heart palpitations will also increase. So all these will result in, that is, altitude sickness. So what is the reason? As I told you, because the low atmospheric pressure of high altitude, the body will not get enough amount of oxygen. But gradually what happens, our body after a few minutes, depending on from one person to other, our body gradually starts to adapt itself, or it starts to acclimatize itself to that particular climatic condition, and we will stop experiencing the altitude sickness. So this is because in the low atmospheric pressure of high altitudes, the body does not get enough of oxygen. So that is what I had told you. So now, but gradually you get acclimatized, that is, you will get adapted and you will stop to experience the altitude sickness. So this is how travelers who go to Rohtang Pass, this is what they experience, and their body gets adapted after a few hours of spending in that particular higher altitude. But what about the people who live in that particular area or are the inhabitants of that particular area? Actually, they have a different mechanism. So we'll move into that. Before that, I had told you the travelers who visit the Rohtang Pass or visit any of the higher altitudes. So in the previous slide, we had discussed that how we get adjusted to the higher altitudes after some duration of time. How is that actually possible? How does a body adjust? So the body compensates for low oxygen by increasing the red blood cell production. So we need to understand here that the red blood cells in the body are very important. So the hemoglobin is the pigment or the component that actually gives the red color to the blood. So it is hemoglobin Hb, and that is why the blood is red in color, and the red blood cells are the ones which carry the oxygen. So for every hemoglobin molecule is made up of 4 iron components. 4 iron components. So each of these iron component has capable of receiving 1 oxygen. So therefore 4 oxygen. So one red blood cell will carry 4 oxygen molecules. So each of these oxygen molecules, now if it has to carry 4 oxygen molecules, so much we have to breathe in. But what is happening in the higher altitudes? There is low oxygen, right? But that is why we'll start breathing fast, so that how much ever oxygen is there, we can take it fast. So every time, and also the amount of oxygen that we take in a faster rate because of a faster breathing, there should be enough of red blood cells to receive those oxygen and take it to the heart, right? So that is when, after some time, what happens, the body itself adapts in such a way that to the maximum amount of oxygen that we are taking in a faster rate, it produces that many number of red blood cells. So the number of red blood cells will start to increase. Therefore, the binding affinity of the hemoglobin will also increase. And how will we get enough amount of oxygen in spite of the oxygen surrounding us is less? It is because of a faster breathing, that is increasing breathing rate. So this is what happens. So that is why many tribes living in the high altitudes of Himalaya, they have, thus to increase the breathing rate, more and more blood cells will get produced and in the body, whereas in the plains there is adequate amount of oxygen in air, and therefore people do not need to increase their breathing. So what happens here is, so the people who are living in higher altitudes or who are the inhabitants of the higher altitudes, such as the tribes of the Himalayas, their breathing rate will always be faster, and also the amount of red blood cells in their body will always be more when compared to that of the people living in the plain. Why? This is the reason, because in higher altitudes the oxygen is very less, so in order to take in too much of oxygen, the breathing rate increases, and as the breathing rate increases, the number of oxygen that enters into the lungs increases, and to collect that oxygen, a lot of RBC cells has to be produced, and that is why these people living in that is the tribes or the peoples inhabiting the higher altitudes, they actually have more number of red blood cells produced in the body when compared to the people living in the plain areas. So that is why people living in the plain area have lesser amount of the red blood cells or the RBC. So this is how humans adapt themselves to higher altitudes. So next, talking about the other examples, like if the temperature. So there previously we had understood the temperature in the deserts. So how animals adapt themselves to desert conditions. Then we also learned how animals adapt themselves to the polar conditions, and also how humans adapt themselves to higher altitude conditions when the availability of oxygen is less. Now we shall see how some organisms adapt themselves to very high temperature, that is more than 100 degrees centigrade. So here the example that we can take of is microbes, that is the Archae Bacteria. So these Archae Bacteria, they usually survive in hot springs, and also they survive in deep sea hydrothermal vents wherein the temperature is more than 100 degree centigrade. So about this we had studied in the previous session as well, right? So no other organisms can live in a temperature above 100 degrees centigrade. That is, these temperatures are usually seen in the hydrothermal vents that are present deep under the bottoms of the ocean, and also that is more than 500 meters deep under the ocean. These hydrothermal vents are present, and also hot springs also, they have very hot water gushing out of the stones, the ground and all that. So there also the temperature is very high, but in spite of that high temperature, these thermophilic bacteria, which are called as the Archae Bacteria, they are able to survive there. So that is how these microbes survive more in temperatures more than 100 degree centigrade. So one more example. So we can talk about the example of how marine invertebrates survive in different salinities. So here we all know that not just different salinities, but also some of them survive in different depths of the ocean. So here a variety of marine invertebrates and also some of the fishes, they live in the greater depths of the ocean where the pressure. So it is very difficult for us to withstand the water pressure. And with the water pressure is quite high, to swim also it is very difficult. That is why without the gear and all that, we cannot go into oceans, which is deep oceans or deep parts of the ocean, we cannot go. So, but these marine invertebrates and these fishes, they can survive and they live in quite a depth of oceans where the pressure is more than 100 times than that of the atmospheric pressure. So they are capable of surviving there. They have adapted themselves to survive in a pressure in the oceans which is more than 100 times, that is, which is 100 times more than that of the atmospheric pressure. So next examples that we can take is of some of the reptiles, how they adapt themselves to live in desert where the temperature is scorching hot with very less rainfall. So some organisms, they show some behavioral responses to tolerate the variations in their habitat or in the temperature of the habitat in which they are living. So the best example that we can take of is the desert lizard. So desert lizard, they do not have any physiological ability when compared to other mammals in order to deal with high temperature. These are conformers. They are not capable of regulating their body temperature like how other mammals, like we human beings, we can do it. So how do these survive in their habitat? So these desert lizards, they manage to keep their body temperature by undergoing some behavioral modifications. So what are those behavioral modifications or behavioral adaptations that they undergo? We shall see. So what do these do is they bask in the sun and absorb heat when their body temperature drops. I told you deserts during the daytime, noon and all that, the desert temperature is quite hot. But as soon as the night falls, the desert temperature drops, making the deserts quite cold, which these animals are not capable of withstanding. So what these animals do is, once the morning comes, they will just come out of their burrows, they will bask in their sun, and in order to absorb the heat from the sun. So once they absorb the heat from the sun, they will automatically regulate their body temperature. And once they regulate their body temperature, then they will move to the shade. Why? Next, the temperature in the desert will be very high, that is in the mornings and the afternoon and all that. So that is when they will move to the shade when the temperature is very high, and or they will just enter into their burrow. So that is how they regulate, because they're not capable of regulating their body temperature. Like what we do if we feel cold, sometimes in winters we go out and stand in the sun, right? Just like that, these organisms also, they do that. They bask in the sun during the cold conditions. And some species are capable of burrowing into the soil in order to hide as well as to escape the extreme heat of the desert. So this is how these desert reptiles, which are also one of the best examples for conformers, they actually regulate their body temperature by some behavioral modifications such as basking in the sun, entering into their burrows and all that. So this was about this particular session wherein we studied how animals adapt to different environmental conditions by taking various examples. So in the coming session, we shall study about population. So far we had studied about organism. This chapter is about organism and population. We studied about organisms. Now, in the next session onwards, we shall study about population. In that, we shall see what are the different attributes of a population or characteristics of a population. So we shall meet again in the coming session. Thank you.